Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. At 22, she carried herself with a quiet strength that came from years of overcoming challenges that would have broken most people. Her dark hair was usually pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her brown eyes held a depth that spoke of experiences far beyond her years. Growing up in a military family, Sarah understood the weight of service and sacrifice. Her father, Colonel James Martinez, had served 3 tours overseas before retiring to become a high school teacher. Her mother, Elena, was a nurse who had worked in veteran hospitals for most of Sarah's childhood. The Martinez household was one where discipline, honor, and helping others weren't just words. They were a way of life. Sarah's childhood wasn't easy. When she was 8 years old, her father was deployed to Afghanistan for 18 months. During that time, her mother worked double shifts to keep the family afloat, leaving Sarah to care for her younger brother Miguel, who was only 5. She learned to cook simple meals, help with homework, and manage household tasks that most children her age never had to think about. The real test came when Sarah was 14. Her father returned from his final deployment changed, haunted by things he couldn't talk about. Like many veterans, he struggled with what doctors later diagnosed as PTSD. There were nights when he would wake up screaming, days when he couldn't leave his bedroom, and weeks when the strong man Sarah had always looked up to seemed like a stranger. Instead of falling apart, Sarah became the glue that held her family together. She researched PTSD, learned about treatment options, and convinced her father to seek help. She organized family activities that would help him reconnect with civilian life. When Miguel started acting out at school because of the stress at home, Sarah was the one who sat with him every night, helping him understand that their father's struggle didn't mean he loved them any less. During her high school years, Sarah volunteered at the local VA hospital, where she met dozens of veterans dealing with their own battles. She listened to their stories, helped them write letters to family members, and organized small events to lift their spirits. Her natural empathy and genuine care for others made her popular among the patients, who often asked specifically for Sarah's girl when they needed someone to talk to. It was during one of these volunteer sessions that Sarah met Antonio Vasquez, a young veteran who had lost his leg in an IED explosion in Iraq. Antonio was bitter and angry, refusing to participate in physical therapy and pushing away anyone who tried to help. Most volunteers avoided him, but Sarah saw something in his eyes that reminded her of her father during his darkest days. She began visiting Antonio regularly, not to offer advice or try to cheer him up, but simply to sit with him. Sometimes they would play cards in silence. Other times she would read aloud from books he enjoyed. Slowly, Antonio began to open up about his experiences, his fears about the future, and his struggle to find meaning in his life after losing his leg. Their friendship deepened over months, and eventually, Antonio began participating in his therapy sessions. Sarah was there to celebrate his small victories. The first time he stood on his prosthetic leg, his first successful walk down the hospital corridor, and the day he was finally discharged to return home to his family. Before leaving, Antonio asked Sarah to meet him in the hospital garden. With tears in his eyes, he thanked her for seeing him as a person, rather than just another damaged veteran. He gave her a small gift, a silver pendant with a dove engraved on it, representing the peace she had helped him find. "Promise me something," Antonio said, holding the pendant as he fastened it around Sarah's neck. "Promise me that you'll never forget that one person can make all the difference in someone's life. You saved mine, Sarah. Don't ever doubt the power of compassion." Sarah wore the pendant every day from that moment forward. It became more than just jewelry. It was a reminder of her purpose and the impact she could have on others' lives. After graduating high school, Sarah decided to pursue a degree in social work, specializing in military family services. She wanted to help other families navigate the challenges that military life could bring. Her professors were impressed by her maturity and real-world experience, often using her insights to enrich classroom discussions. During her college years, Sarah continued volunteering and took on leadership roles in various organizations supporting veterans and their families. She organized fundraising events, coordinated support groups for military spouses, and developed programs to help veteran children cope with their parents' deployment and reintegration challenges. Sarah's reputation for compassion and effectiveness grew throughout her college years. She was featured in the local newspaper for her volunteer work, received several community service awards, and was frequently asked to speak at events about the importance of supporting military families. As she approached graduation, Sarah faced a difficult decision about her future. Several social service organizations had offered her positions, and she had been accepted into a master's program in clinical psychology. However, there was also an opportunity that would take her far from everything familiar, a chance to work with an international, humanitarian organization providing support to conflict zones around the world. The position would require her to travel to dangerous areas, working with displaced families, war-torn communities, and traumatized individuals who had lost everything. It was risky, challenging, and would mean leaving her family and comfortable life behind. But something deep inside Sarah told her this was where she was meant to be. Her parents were worried but ultimately supportive. They had raised her to follow her convictions and to use her gifts to help others, even when it meant personal sacrifice. Miguel, now a teenager himself, was proud of his sister's courage and promised to help take care of their parents while she was away. 3 months after graduation, Sarah found herself on a plane headed to Eastern Europe, where civil conflict had displaced thousands of families. She carried with her a single suitcase, her determination to make a difference, and the silver dove pendant that had become her talisman. As the plane lifted off, Sarah looked down at the lights of her hometown disappearing below. She had no way of knowing that this journey would lead her to a moment that would test everything she believed about courage, compassion, and the power of human connection. In a few short weeks, she would find herself standing before 200 soldiers in a situation that would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone present. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris, its rotors creating a whirlwind that forced Sarah to shield her eyes and hold tight to her backpack. As the engine noise faded, she found herself standing in what had once been a school playground in the small village of Komarevo, nestled in the mountains of Eastern Europe. Now the playground served as a landing zone for humanitarian aid, its colorful swing sets and slides standing like monuments to a peaceful time that seemed impossibly distant. Sarah's supervisor, Dr. Elena Petrov, was waiting for her with a warm but tired smile. Dr. Petrov was a seasoned humanitarian worker who had spent 15 years in conflict zones around the world. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her clothes showed the dust and wear of someone who spent more time in refugee camps than in comfortable offices. "Welcome to Komarevo," Dr. Petrov said, extending her hand. "I hope you're ready to hit the ground running. We've got 300 displaced families in the camps and more arriving every day." As they walked through the village, Sarah was struck by the contrast between destruction and resilience. Many buildings showed damage from recent fighting, walls pockmarked with bullet holes, roofs partially collapsed, windows boarded up with whatever materials people could find. Yet amid this destruction, life continued. Children played in the streets, elderly men sat on makeshift stools playing chess, and women hung laundry on lines stretched between damaged buildings. The refugee camp was located in what used to be the village's central park. Dozens of white tents provided basic shelter for families who had fled fighting in surrounding areas. Sarah could hear multiple languages being spoken, the local dialect but also Arabic, Dari, and others she couldn't identify. This wasn't just a local conflict. People from various ongoing wars had found their way to this temporary sanctuary. Dr. Petrov introduced Sarah to the team she would be working with. There was Marcus, a medical coordinator from Germany who had been running the camp's health services for 6 months. His gentle manner and patient smile made him instantly likable, though Sarah noticed the exhaustion in his eyes. There was also Fatima, a translator and cultural liaison, who had herself been a refugee 5 years earlier, and now helped others navigate the complex process of seeking safety and assistance. "Our job here is complicated," Dr. Petrov explained as they toured the facilities. "We're not just providing food and shelter. These people have lost everything, their homes, their communities, their sense of security. Many have witnessed terrible things. They need psychological support, help processing their trauma, and hope that life can get better." Sarah's first assignment was to work with families who had children. Many of the kids in the camp had stopped speaking. Others had frequent nightmares, and some displayed aggressive behavior that worried their parents. Using techniques she had learned working with military families, Sarah began organizing activities that would help children express their feelings and begin to heal. She set up art therapy sessions using donated supplies, encouraging kids to draw pictures of their feelings or memories. She organized simple games that helped them rebuild trust with adults and other children. Most importantly, she listened, really listened, to their stories, validating their experiences and helping them understand that their reactions were normal responses to abnormal situations. One child, a 7-year-old boy named Amir, particularly captured Sarah's attention. Amir hadn't spoken since arriving at the camp 3 weeks earlier. His mother, Layla, explained through Fatima's translation that their village had been attacked in the middle of the night. Amir had hidden under his bed while armed men searched their house, and he had watched his father being taken away. They hadn't heard from Amir's father since that night. Sarah spent hours sitting quietly with Amir, not pushing him to talk, but simply being present. She showed him how to make simple origami animals, watched him carefully stack small stones into towers, and read him picture books even though he gave no indication that he was paying attention. After 2 weeks, during one of their quiet sessions, Amir suddenly looked up at Sarah and whispered, "Will the bad men come here too?" It was the first time anyone had heard his voice since the attack on his village. Word of Sarah's success with the children spread quickly through the camp. Parents began bringing their kids to her sessions, and she found herself running multiple groups throughout each day. She helped teenagers process their anger and fear, worked with mothers who were struggling to comfort children while dealing with their own trauma, and created safe spaces where families could begin to heal together. But Sarah's work wasn't limited to the refugee camp. Dr. Petrov also assigned her to visit surrounding villages, assessing needs and providing support to families who had chosen to stay in their damaged communities rather than flee to the camps. These visits required traveling on rough mountain roads in areas where fighting had recently occurred. During one of these village visits, Sarah met an elderly woman named Milika who had refused to leave her home despite her village being nearly deserted. Milika lived alone in a house with no electricity or running water, tending to a small garden and a few chickens. When Sarah asked why she stayed, Milika smiled and pointed to a small cemetery behind her house. "My husband is buried here," Milika explained through Fatima's translation. "My children, my grandchildren, they are all here too. If I leave, who will remember them? Who will tend their graves and tell their stories?" Sarah spent the afternoon helping Melissa repair a section of her roof that had been damaged by shrapnel. As they worked together, Malika shared stories of her village before the conflict: harvest festivals, weddings, children playing in the streets, families gathering for Sunday dinners. She spoke of neighbors who had become enemies overnight, of friends who had fled in the night without saying goodbye. "War doesn't just destroy buildings," Malika said, her weathered hands steady as she helped Sarah secure a tarp over the damaged roof. "It destroys the connections between people. It makes us forget that we are all human beings with the same hopes and fears." These words stayed with Sarah as she returned to the camp that evening. She began to understand that her role wasn't just about providing aid or counseling services. She was helping to rebuild the social fabric that war had torn apart, one conversation and one small act of kindness at a time. As weeks passed, Sarah settled into a routine that was both exhausting and deeply fulfilling. Her days started before dawn, often with emergency situations, a family arriving in the middle of the night, a medical crisis, or reports of renewed fighting in nearby areas. She learned to function on little sleep, to make difficult decisions quickly, and to find hope in the smallest signs of progress. The international team she worked with became like a second family. They shared meals, celebrated small victories together, and supported each other through the inevitable moments of doubt and despair that came with this type of work. Sarah's natural leadership abilities and compassionate approach made her valuable not just to the refugees she served, but to her colleagues who often sought her advice and perspective on difficult situations. However, as autumn approached, the security situation in the region began to deteriorate. Reports reached the camp of increased military activity in surrounding areas, and Dr. Petrov received warnings from their security contacts that all international aid workers might need to evacuate on short notice. Sarah watched the concern grow on the faces of the refugees as news of nearby fighting spread through the camp. Families who had thought they were safe began to fear that they might have to flee again. Children who had started to smile and play became withdrawn and anxious once more. It was during this tense period that Sarah received word that would change everything. A message came through military channels requesting that she accompany a delegation to meet with local commanders about ensuring continued access for humanitarian aid. The meeting would take place at a military compound in the mountains, where various faction leaders had agreed to discuss terms for allowing aid workers to continue their operations. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized that this meeting could determine whether thousands of refugees would continue to receive help or be forced to flee once again into an uncertain and dangerous world. The morning of the mission dawned cold and gray, with heavy clouds hanging low over the mountain peaks. Sarah stood outside her tent at 5 a.m., checking and rechecking the contents of her backpack while trying to calm the nervous energy that had kept her awake most of the night. She had packed light, basic medical supplies, emergency food rations, a water purification system, and the small notebook where she recorded details about the families she worked with. Dr. Petrov approached with a serious expression that Sarah had rarely seen during their weeks working together. "Sarah, I need you to understand exactly what you're walking into today," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't a typical negotiation meeting. The commanders we're meeting with represent 3 different factions that have been fighting each other for months. The only reason they've agreed to this discussion is because international pressure has made it politically necessary." The delegation consisted of 4 people: Sarah, Dr. Petrov, Colonel Anderson from the International Peacekeeping Force, and Dmitry Volkov, a seasoned diplomat who had negotiated humanitarian agreements in conflict zones across Africa and the Middle East. Each member of the team brought different expertise: medical knowledge, field experience, military understanding, and diplomatic skills. Colonel Anderson briefed the team as they prepared to depart. The meeting location is a former monastery that's now being used as a command center by the Kovac faction. It's about 3 hours by road through mountain passes that have seen heavy fighting recently. We'll have an escort for the first half of the journey, but the final approach will be just our vehicle. As they climbed into the armored SUV that would transport them, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She thought about Amir, who had finally started drawing pictures of his father and talking about his memories. She thought about Milika, alone in her village, tending to graves and keeping memories alive. She thought about the hundreds of families whose lives might be affected by whatever happened in the next few hours. The journey through the mountains was both beautiful and terrifying. The landscape was stunning: deep valleys, snow-capped peaks, and forests that seemed untouched by human conflict. But reminders of war were everywhere. They passed burned villages, abandoned checkpoints, and crater marks from artillery strikes. Along the roadside, Sarah saw improvised memorials, small crosses, flowers, and photographs marking places where people had died. Their escort vehicle turned back at a checkpoint marked only by concrete barriers and coils of razor wire. From here, they would continue alone into territory controlled by forces they hoped were still committed to allowing the meeting to proceed safely. Colonel Anderson checked his radio equipment one final time, confirming that they could still communicate with the peacekeeping base. Though the signal grew weaker with each mile, they traveled deeper into the mountains. About an hour before reaching their destination, they encountered their first checkpoint. 3 soldiers emerged from a bunker carved into the hillside, their weapons ready but not directly threatening. One of them, a young man who couldn't have been older than 20, approached the driver's side window and spoke in the local language. Dmitry, who was fluent in several regional dialects, handled the conversation while Sarah watched the interaction carefully. What struck Sarah most was how young the soldier looked. Despite his weapon and military gear, she could see uncertainty in his eyes, the same kind of fear and confusion she had observed in refugee children. This boy, because that's what he was despite his uniform, was probably fighting in a war he didn't fully understand, carrying out orders from commanders he might never have met. After examining their documents and making a radio call to his superiors, the soldier waved them through. As they drove away, Sarah found herself thinking about how many young people on all sides of this conflict were being asked to make life-and-death decisions before they were old enough to fully understand the consequences. The former monastery where the meeting would take place sat on a high plateau surrounded by steep cliffs. It was a magnificent building. Ancient stone walls, towers that had stood for centuries, and courtyards that had once provided peaceful sanctuary for monks seeking spiritual contemplation. Now military vehicles were parked where gardens once grew, and soldiers patrolled walls that had been built for prayer and reflection. As their SUV approached the main gate, Sarah could see dozens of armed men positioned throughout the compound. Some wore official military uniforms, others dressed in a mixture of civilian clothes and military gear that suggested they were part of irregular forces. The variety of weapons, vehicles, and equipment indicated that multiple groups were represented here, each with their own agenda and concerns. Colonel Anderson had warned them that this meeting was unprecedented. It was extremely rare for commanders from opposing factions to agree to meet in the same location. The fact that it was happening at all suggested that pressure from international organizations and regional governments was having an effect. But it also meant that tensions would be extremely high. They were escorted into the monastery's main hall, a large stone room with high-vaulted ceilings and narrow windows that let in streams of dusty sunlight. Long wooden tables had been arranged in a rectangular configuration, with chairs positioned so that each faction's representatives could see the others while maintaining some distance. The setup reminded Sarah of peace negotiations she had seen in documentaries, but the presence of armed guards at every entrance made the gravity of the situation unmistakable. As the various commanders and their advisors began arriving, Sarah observed the complex dynamics at play. Some men greeted each other with formal nods, suggesting they had dealt with each other before. Others maintained deliberate distance, their body language indicating deep mistrust or outright hostility. A few of the commanders were older men with gray hair and weathered faces that spoke of long years of conflict. Others were surprisingly young, perhaps promoted quickly due to battlefield losses or political changes. The discussions began slowly, with each side presenting their positions regarding humanitarian access to disputed territories. Dmitri took the lead in presenting the international community's requests: guaranteed safe passage for aid workers, protection for refugee camps, and agreements to avoid targeting civilian infrastructure like hospitals and schools. Sarah's role was to provide specific information about the humanitarian situation, the number of displaced families, medical needs, educational requirements for children, and the psychological support necessary for trauma recovery. As she spoke, she noticed that some of the commanders listened intently, while others seemed distracted or uninterested in details about civilian welfare. One commander, General Marko Petrovich, asked detailed questions about the refugee camps and the international support being provided. Sarah explained the work being done with children, the medical services available, and the efforts to help families maintain hope despite their circumstances. General Petrovich nodded thoughtfully and made notes, suggesting that he understood the importance of civilian considerations in military decision-making. However, as the discussions progressed, it became clear that the commanders disagreed fundamentally about territorial control, resource allocation, and the terms under which they would allow international organizations to operate in areas under their influence. Voices began rising, accusations were made, and several times Colonel Anderson had to intervene to prevent the discussions from breaking down entirely. During a break in the negotiations, Sarah stepped outside into one of the monastery's courtyards to clear her head. The mountain air was thin and cold, and she could see for miles across valleys and peaks that stretched to the horizon. It was hard to imagine that such a beautiful landscape could be the setting for so much human suffering. As she stood there, reflecting on the morning's discussions and preparing mentally for what she hoped would be productive afternoon sessions, Sarah had no way of knowing that events were already in motion that would transform this diplomatic meeting into something entirely different. Military units were moving through the mountains, communications were being intercepted, and decisions were being made by people who had not been part of the morning's conversations. The afternoon session was about to begin when everything changed. The sound of helicopters approaching broke the afternoon silence like thunder rolling across the mountains. Sarah looked up from her notebook where she had been reviewing points for the next phase of negotiations, watching as military aircraft appeared over the monastery walls. But these weren't the transport helicopters she had become familiar with during her time in the region. These were attack helicopters, flying in formation with weapons clearly visible. Colonel Anderson immediately reached for his radio, his face tense with concern. After a brief exchange with his base, he turned to the group with grim news. "We have reports of a major military operation beginning in this sector. All roads in and out of this area are being blocked by government forces. It appears that someone has decided to use this gathering as an opportunity to capture or eliminate several faction leaders at once. Dr. Petrov's face went pale. Are you saying we're trapped here? Before Colonel Anderson could respond, armed soldiers began pouring into the courtyard, not the relatively relaxed guards who had been present during the morning's negotiations, but combat troops in full battle gear, moving with the urgency of men preparing for immediate conflict. Sarah could hear shouting in multiple languages, the sound of vehicles starting up, and the metallic clicking of weapons being readied for use. General Petrovich, the commander who had asked thoughtful questions about the refugee situation, appeared in the doorway with his own security detail. His demeanor had changed completely from the diplomatic figure of the morning. Now he looked like what he was, a military leader facing a potential life-or-death situation. The government forces have surrounded the monastery, he announced grimly. They're demanding that all faction leaders surrender unconditionally within 2 hours, or they will begin a full assault on the compound. They've made it clear that they consider everyone present to be enemy combatants, including international personnel. Sarah felt her heart racing as the implications became clear. She wasn't just an observer at a diplomatic meeting anymore. She was potentially a prisoner in what could become a battle zone. The work she had come to do, the families depending on her, the children who had learned to trust her, all of it seemed suddenly very far away. Dmitri, despite his years of experience in dangerous situations, looked shaken. This is a clear violation of international law. The attacking forces know that humanitarian workers are present. We have diplomatic immunity. General Petrovich shook his head sadly. International law matters very little when men with guns decide they want to settle old scores. The commander of the government forces attacking us is Colonel Viktor Razin. He lost 2 of his brothers in fighting with our units last year. For him, this is personal. The next hour passed in a blur of activity and growing tension. The various faction commanders held hurried consultations with their advisors, trying to determine their options. Some advocated for attempting to break through the encirclement and escape into the mountains. Others wanted to negotiate directly with the attacking forces. A few suggested that they should surrender to protect the international personnel present. Sarah found herself thinking not about her own safety, but about the refugee families who would be affected if this situation escalated into open warfare. If the faction leaders were captured or killed, who would control the territories where the camps were located? Would the fighting spread to areas that had been relatively safe? Would families who had already lost everything be forced to flee again? As the afternoon wore on, the sound of heavy vehicles and military equipment grew closer. Through the monastery's narrow windows, Sarah could see government forces establishing positions on surrounding hillsides, setting up artillery pieces and defensive positions that indicated they were prepared for a prolonged engagement if necessary. Colonel Anderson managed to establish contact with his peacekeeping headquarters, but the response was not encouraging. They're aware of our situation, but the attacking forces are not responding to diplomatic contacts. The government claims this is a legitimate military operation against terrorist leaders, and they're not acknowledging that international personnel are present. By late afternoon, it became clear that the government forces were not going to allow anyone to leave the monastery compound. Several attempts by faction representatives to approach the perimeter under white flags had been turned back with warning shots. The 2-hour deadline for surrender was approaching, and there was no indication that either side was prepared to back down. It was then that General Petrovich made an announcement that changed everything. Colonel Razin has agreed to a face-to-face meeting to discuss terms. But he has specific conditions. He wants to see all the faction leaders present, and he wants to address them directly. He's demanding that everyone, commanders, advisors, international personnel, gather in the main courtyard at exactly 6 p.m. Sarah felt a chill run through her as she realized what this meant. They were being asked to assemble in an open area where they would be completely vulnerable. There would be no cover, no protection, no way to escape if the situation went bad. It felt like walking into a trap. We don't have a choice, Colonel Anderson said quietly. If we refuse, they'll likely begin the assault immediately. At least this way we have a chance to negotiate something. As 6 p.m. approached, Sarah found herself walking with the others toward the main courtyard, her mind racing with thoughts of everyone who would be affected by whatever happened in the next few minutes. She thought about her parents back home, who had raised her to believe in the importance of helping others even when it involved personal risk. She thought about Antonio, the wounded veteran who had given her the silver dove pendant that now hung around her neck, hidden beneath her jacket. The courtyard was a large stone-paved area surrounded by the monastery's ancient walls. As the group assembled, Sarah counted approximately 40 people, the 3 faction leaders and their key advisors, the international delegation, and a handful of security personnel. They stood in the center of the courtyard as armed guards took positions along the walls, their weapons trained on the group. The massive wooden gates of the monastery began to open with a sound like thunder. Through the opening, Sarah could see military vehicles, soldiers in combat gear, and equipment that spoke of serious military power. This was no longer a diplomatic meeting or even a tense standoff. This was a moment when anything could happen. As government forces began entering the courtyard, Sarah noticed that many of the soldiers looked young and nervous. These weren't seasoned veterans. Comfortable with complex situations, they were young men following orders in a situation that was probably as frightening for them as it was for everyone else. Colonel Razin entered the courtyard surrounded by his personal guard, 6 soldiers with automatic weapons who moved with the precision of an elite unit. Razin himself was a tall, lean man with graying hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the assembled group. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You are all under arrest as enemy combatants and terrorists," he announced in accented English, clearly intended for the international personnel to understand. "You will be transported to facilities where you will be questioned about your activities and associations. Anyone who attempts to resist will be shot immediately." The silence that followed was profound. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, the sound of wind in the monastery's ancient stones, and the subtle movements of nervous soldiers trying to maintain their positions while watching for any sign of trouble. It was at this moment, as 200 soldiers stood ready with weapons trained on the small group of assembled people, that Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She stepped forward, separating herself from the group and walking directly toward Colonel Razin. Sarah's footsteps echoed across the stone courtyard as she walked toward Colonel Razin, each step feeling like it took an eternity. Behind her, she could hear Dr. Petrov whisper urgently, "Sarah, no." But something deep inside her knew that this was the moment she had been preparing for her entire life, even though she had never imagined it would look like this. Colonel Razin watched her approach with cold calculation, his hand resting on his sidearm. The soldiers around him tensed, their weapons shifting slightly to track her movement. Sarah could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on her, the collective held breath of people who thought they were watching someone walk toward certain death. When she was about 10 feet from Colonel Razin, Sarah stopped and spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried across the silent courtyard. "Colonel, I request permission to speak with you privately. I believe there are things you need to know about the people you're holding here." Razin's eyebrows rose slightly, more in surprise than interest. "You are in no position to make requests, humanitarian worker. You are a prisoner, and you will be treated as such." Sarah took another step closer, ignoring the immediate response of soldiers raising their weapons. "My name is Sarah Martinez. I am the daughter of Colonel James Martinez, United States Army, retired. I have spent the last 6 months working with refugee families in camps throughout this region. These people you're about to arrest include the only individuals who can guarantee safe passage for medical supplies to reach 3,000 displaced civilians, including 800 children under the age of 10. Something flickered in Colonel Razin's eyes at the mention of her military family background, but his expression remained stern. "Your father's rank means nothing here. This is not America's war." Sarah nodded respectfully. "You're absolutely right, Colonel. This isn't America's war. But it is a war that's creating widows and orphans just like wars everywhere else. I've met them. I've held children while they cried for fathers who will never come home. I've helped mothers figure out how to feed their families when everything they owned was destroyed." She paused, letting her words sink in, then continued. "I know you lost your brothers in this conflict, sir. I know this is personal for you. But I also know that every man in your command has a mother somewhere who prays every night that her son will come home safely. Every one of these faction leaders you want to arrest has family members who are depending on them to survive. Colonel Razan's expression hardened. Do not speak to me about my brothers. You know nothing about what was taken from my family. Sarah reached slowly into her jacket, moving carefully to avoid alarming the soldiers. Colonel Razan's hand moved to his weapon, but Sarah continued with deliberate, non-threatening movements. From inside her jacket, she pulled out the small, silver pendant that Antonio had given her, the dove that represented peace and hope. Colonel, I'm not going to pretend I understand your pain, or that I can solve the problems that led to this war, she said, holding the pendant where he could see it. But I want to show you something that was given to me by a soldier who had also lost everything. She told him briefly about Antonio, the young veteran who had lost his leg, who had been angry and hopeless, who had wanted to give up on life entirely. She described how he had slowly found his way back to hope, not because anyone fixed his problems or gave him easy answers, but because someone had been willing to sit with him in his pain and see him as a human being, rather than just another casualty. This pendant was given to me by that soldier when he realized that he wanted to live again, that he wanted to build something positive from his experience rather than let it destroy him, Sarah explained. He told me never to forget that one person can make all the difference in someone's life. As she spoke, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the posture and expressions of some of the soldiers around her. Several of the younger ones had lowered their weapons slightly, their attention focused on her words rather than maintaining their threatening positions. She could see recognition in their eyes. These were young men who had also experienced loss, who had also struggled with the meaning of their experiences in war. Colonel Razan studied the pendant for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Why are you showing me this? Sarah took a deep breath before answering. Because I believe that every person in this courtyard, including you, Colonel, has the capacity to choose whether they want to be remembered as someone who created more orphans and widows or as someone who had the courage to break a cycle of violence when they had the power to do so. She gestured toward the assembled group behind her. These faction leaders you want to arrest, they're not perfect men. They've made decisions that have cost lives. But they're also the only people who can authorize safe corridors for medical supplies, who can guarantee that refugee camps won't be attacked, who can ensure that families have somewhere safe to go when the fighting moves to new areas. Sarah could see that her words were having an effect, not just on Colonel Razan but on many of the soldiers surrounding them. She noticed one young soldier in particular, positioned near the monastery's main entrance, who was listening intently while tears ran down his face. Something in her words had touched a personal memory or experience that connected with his own story. Colonel, I have a proposal, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. Instead of arresting these men and creating a power vacuum that will lead to more chaos and suffering, what if we work together to create something different? What if this moment, right here, right now, became the beginning of a real peace process instead of just another chapter in an endless cycle of revenge? Colonel Razan was quiet for several long minutes, his gaze moving from Sarah to the pendant in her hand, then to the faces of his own soldiers, and finally to the group of faction leaders behind her. Sarah could see him processing not just her words, but the entire situation he found himself in. Finally he spoke, but his words were directed not to Sarah but to General Petrovich. General, you killed my youngest brother last spring in the battle for Velika village. He was 19 years old. He had been married for 6 months, and his wife was pregnant with their first child. General Petrovich stepped forward, his own voice heavy with emotion. Colonel, your forces killed my nephew in that same battle. He was 17. He lied about his age to join my unit because he wanted to protect his village. I think about him every day. Sarah watched as these two military commanders looked at each other across the courtyard, each seeing in the other's face the reflection of their own loss and pain. The tension in the air was palpable, but it was different now. Not the electric tension of imminent violence, but the heavy tension of men confronting truths they had been avoiding. This is what war does, Sarah said quietly, but her voice carried clearly in the silence. It takes young people with their whole lives ahead of them and turns them into statistics. It takes fathers and brothers and sons and reduces them to names on memorial walls. But it doesn't have to keep happening. She turned to address not just Colonel Razin and General Petrovich, but all the soldiers in the courtyard. Every one of you has lost someone. Every one of you has a family somewhere hoping you'll come home. Every one of you joined the military because you believed you were protecting something important. Your country, your community, your way of life. Sarah's voice grew more passionate as she continued. But look around this courtyard. Look at the faces of the men standing next to you. They're not monsters. They're not evil. They're soldiers just like you, fighting for causes they believe in, carrying the same kinds of loss and pain and hope that you carry. She reached up and unclasped the silver pendant from around her neck, holding it up so that everyone in the courtyard could see it clearly. This pendant represents the choice between hope and despair, between building something new and destroying what remains. The soldier who gave it to me could have spent the rest of his life consumed by anger about what he had lost. Instead, he chose to use his experience to help other people find their way back to hope. Sarah walked to the center of the courtyard, positioning herself exactly between Colonel Razin and General Petrovich. I'm going to leave this pendant here in this space between all of you, not as a religious symbol or a political statement, but as a reminder that this moment, this exact moment, is a choice point. You can choose to repeat the same patterns that have been destroying this region for years, or you can choose to be the generation that said enough. She placed the pendant on the stone ground and stepped back. Colonel Razin, you have the power to arrest everyone here, to continue the cycle of conflict, to create more orphans and widows. Or you have the power to be the leader who had the courage to try something different. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah could hear the wind moving through the monastery's ancient stones, the distant sound of military equipment, and the quiet breathing of 200 people waiting to see what would happen next. Then, unexpectedly, the young soldier who had been crying near the entrance stepped forward. His weapon was lowered, and he spoke in heavily accented English. Colonel, sir, I have question. My village, it is in sector controlled by General Petrovich forces. My family, they are safe because General allows humanitarian aid to reach civilian population. If we arrest General, who will protect my family? This simple question from a young soldier opened a floodgate. Other soldiers began speaking up, asking questions about the practical consequences of the arrests, sharing their own stories of family members in refugee camps or villages controlled by various factions. Sarah realized that many of these young men had never had the opportunity to think beyond their immediate orders, to consider the broader implications of the conflict they were fighting. Colonel Razin listened to his soldiers with growing attention. Sarah could see him beginning to understand that his men were not just weapons to be pointed at enemies, but human beings with their own concerns, fears, and hopes for the future. After several minutes of discussion among the soldiers, Colonel Razin walked to where Sarah had placed the pendant. He knelt down and picked it up, examining it carefully. When he stood up, his posture had changed. He no longer looked like a commander preparing for battle. He looked like a man wrestling with a difficult decision that would affect many lives. Miss Martinez, he said formally, you have given me much to consider, but there are larger forces at work here than just my personal feelings or even the immediate humanitarian concerns you have raised. I have orders from my superiors. I have political pressures to consider. I have a military hierarchy that expects certain results from this operation. Sarah nodded respectfully. I understand, Colonel, but you also have something else. You have the respect of your men and the power to influence what happens next. Sometimes the most important battles are not fought against external enemies, but against the parts of ourselves that want to choose the easy path instead of the right path. Colonel Razin looked around the courtyard one final time, his gaze taking in the faces of his soldiers, the faction leaders, the international personnel, and finally returning to Sarah. In his hand, he still held the silver pendant, its simple dove catching the late afternoon sunlight that slanted through the monastery's ancient walls. Colonel Razin stood in the center of the courtyard, the silver pendant catching the fading afternoon light as he turned it over in his hands. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, with 200 soldiers and the assembled group waiting to see what decision would shape all their futures. Finally, Colonel Razin spoke, but his words were unexpected. Sergeant Koloff, he called to the young soldier who had asked about his family. "Step forward." The young man approached nervously, clearly uncertain about why he was being singled out. Colonel Razin looked at him for a moment, then asked, "How old are you, Sergeant?" 22, sir," the soldier replied. "The same age as my youngest brother when he died," Colonel Razin said quietly. "Tell me about your family in General Petrovich's territory." Sergeant Koloff glanced nervously at General Petrovich, then back at his commander. "Sir, my mother and 2 sisters live in Srednya village. When fighting came to our area last year, General Petrovich's forces could have treated civilians badly, but they allowed aid workers to enter. They protected non-combatants. My family has food and medical care because of decisions General Petrovich made." Colonel Razin turned to General Petrovich. "Is this true?" General Petrovich nodded. "Sergeant Koloff's family and many others like them. We may be enemies in this war, Colonel, but we do not have to be enemies of innocent people." Sarah watched this exchange with growing hope. She could see that something fundamental was shifting in the dynamics of the situation. The personal was becoming political, the human was becoming strategic, and individual stories were illuminating larger truths about the conflict. Colonel Razin began walking slowly around the courtyard, stopping to speak briefly with several of his soldiers. Sarah couldn't hear all the conversations, but she could see soldiers nodding, some wiping away tears, others showing photos of family members. With each conversation, Colonel Razin's expression became more thoughtful and less rigid. When he returned to the center of the courtyard, Colonel Razin addressed everyone present. "I came here today with orders to arrest terrorist leaders and to demonstrate that the government would no longer tolerate armed opposition to state authority. Those orders came from men in comfortable offices who have never held a dying soldier in their arms, who have never had to explain to a mother why her son will not be coming home." He paused, looking directly at General Petrovich and the other faction leaders. "But I have also listened today to words from a humanitarian worker who has spent months helping families torn apart by this conflict. I have heard from my own soldiers about the complexity of the situation we face, and I have been reminded that every decision we make here will create ripple effects that touch the lives of thousands of innocent people." Sarah felt her heart pounding as she realized that Colonel Razin was genuinely wrestling with competing loyalties and responsibilities. This was no longer a simple military operation. It had become a moment of moral choice that would define how this man saw himself and his role in the larger conflict. "Miss Martinez," Colonel Razin said, turning to face her directly, "you spoke of breaking cycles of violence. You spoke of choosing hope over revenge. These are beautiful words, but this is not a simple situation. If I release these faction leaders, I will be defying direct orders from my superiors. I will likely face court-martial. My career, my reputation, my family's security, all of these things will be at risk." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Colonel, I can't pretend to understand the personal cost of the decision you're facing, but I can tell you that every person who has ever made a difference in this world has faced moments when doing the right thing required personal sacrifice." She gestured toward the soldiers around them. "Look at the faces of your men, sir. They followed you here because they trust your leadership. They believe in you. That trust is not based on your ability to follow orders from distant superiors. It's based on your ability to make good decisions in difficult situations, to consider the welfare of the people under your command, and to act with honor even when it's difficult." Sergeant Koloff stepped forward again, speaking directly to his commander. "Sir, if I may." "The men have been talking. We understand the situation you are in. If you decide to take a stand here to try something different, you will not be standing alone. We are with you." Other soldiers began nodding and murmuring agreement. Sarah could see that Colonel Razin's leadership had earned genuine loyalty from his men. Not just obedience based on rank and authority. This was the kind of loyalty that could only be earned through consistent demonstration of care for subordinates and commitment to principles beyond mere career advancement. Dr. Petrov stepped forward to join the conversation. "Colonel, if I may add something to this discussion. The international community has been watching this region closely, waiting for signs that local leaders are ready to move beyond conflict toward sustainable peace. If you were to become known as the commander who chose dialogue over force, who protected humanitarian workers rather than treating them as enemies, you would have support from organizations around the world." Dmitry, the experienced diplomat, added his perspective. Colonel, I have worked in conflict zones across 3 continents. I have seen situations where military leaders made courageous decisions to break cycles of violence, and I have seen where such decisions led, not to court-martial and disgrace, but to international recognition, to roles in peace processes, to opportunities to shape positive futures for their countries. Colonel Razin listened to all these perspectives, but Sarah could see that his decision would ultimately be personal. No amount of external pressure or support could substitute for his own internal struggle between competing loyalties and values. Finally, Colonel Razin walked over to where General Petrovich stood. The 2 men faced each other across a space of perhaps 3 feet, each representing not just opposing military forces, but different visions of how this conflict might be resolved. General, Colonel Razin said formally, if I were to release you and the other faction leaders here today, what assurance could you give me that this gesture would lead to meaningful progress toward peace? General Petrovich considered the question carefully before responding. Colonel, I cannot promise you that releasing us will end this war immediately. Wars do not end with single gestures, no matter how dramatic. But I can promise you that if you choose dialogue over force today, if you choose to see us as potential partners in peace rather than only as enemies to be destroyed, then you will have taken the first step toward the kind of leadership this region desperately needs. He paused, then continued. I can also promise you that the humanitarian workers you protect today will be able to continue their work in territories under my control. The refugee camps will remain safe. The children that Miss Martinez has been helping will continue to receive the support they need to heal from the trauma of this conflict. Sarah watched Colonel Razin's face as he processed this response. She could see him weighing immediate military objectives against longer-term strategic goals, personal career considerations against moral imperatives, the pressure of orders from above against the voices of soldiers under his command. Then Colonel Razin did something that surprised everyone present. He extended his hand toward General Petrovich in an offer to shake hands. General, he said, I'm going to make a decision that my superiors will not understand and that may cost me my career, but I am going to make it because I believe it is the right decision for the people of this region, for my soldiers, and for my own conscience. As the 2 commanders shook hands in the center of the monastery courtyard, Sarah felt tears running down her face. She understood that she was witnessing one of those rare moments in history when individual courage and moral clarity could change the trajectory of events affecting thousands of lives. But she also understood that this moment was just the beginning. The real work of building peace would require sustained effort, ongoing dialogue, and the commitment of many people working together over months and years. The handshake between 2 commanders was symbolic, but symbols only have power when they are followed by substantive action. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same monastery courtyard, but everything had changed. Where military vehicles had once been parked, there were now tables set up for a peace conference. Where soldiers had stood with weapons ready, delegates from various factions now sat together discussing reconstruction plans. The ancient stones seemed to radiate a different energy, one of hope rather than fear. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the immediate aftermath of Colonel Razin's decision to release the faction leaders, there had been intense political pressure from his superiors. As he had predicted, he faced court-martial proceedings and was stripped of his command. But something unexpected happened. The story of his decision spread quickly through military ranks and civilian populations throughout the region. Sergeant Kolov and many other soldiers under Razin's command requested transfers to serve with him, even knowing it might damage their own careers. International media picked up the story of the humanitarian worker, whose simple act of courage had helped prevent a massacre and potentially change the course of a regional conflict. Support began flowing from unexpected sources. Dr. Petrov had been right about international attention. Within weeks of the monastery incident, Razin received offers from several international organizations to serve as a consultant on conflict resolution. More importantly, his example had inspired other military leaders in the region to question orders that seemed to prioritize political objectives over human welfare. Sarah's role had evolved dramatically. She was no longer just a field worker helping individual families. She had become a coordinator for a new type of peace process that emphasized human stories over political positions. The approach she had used instinctively in the monastery courtyard had become a model for how opposing sides could find common ground. Through personal connection, rather than formal negotiation, the silver pendant that had played such a crucial role that day had taken on symbolic significance beyond anything Sarah could have imagined. Replicas were being worn by peace workers, former soldiers, and family members throughout the region. It had become a simple but powerful symbol of the choice between hope and despair, between building bridges and building walls. But the real changes were visible in the refugee camps where Sarah had first begun her work. Families who had been displaced for years were finally able to return to their villages. Children who had stopped speaking due to trauma were not only talking again but helping younger children process their own experiences. The camps themselves were being transformed from temporary shelters into community centers that supported returning refugees and provided resources for ongoing reconstruction. Amir, the 7-year-old boy who had hidden under his bed during the attack on his village, had become one of Sarah's most remarkable success stories. Not only had he reunited with his father, who had been found alive in a prisoner exchange facilitated by the new cooperation between factions, but he had also become a bridge between children from different ethnic groups in his village. His natural empathy and his experience of trauma and recovery made him uniquely qualified to help other children feel safe and accepted. Milika, the elderly woman who had refused to leave her village, had become an unofficial historian for the peace process. Her small house had become a gathering place where former enemies could meet informally, sharing meals and stories while working out practical details of coexistence. Her cemetery, which she had tended alone for so long, had become a memorial garden where people from all factions could honor their lost loved ones together. Sarah often reflected on how the smallest actions could have the largest consequences. Her decision to step forward in the monastery courtyard had been instinctive, based on principles her parents had taught her and experiences that had shaped her understanding of human nature. She had never imagined that those few minutes of conversation could catalyze such widespread change. Colonel Razin had indeed paid a price for his decision, but it had led to opportunities he never could have anticipated. He was now directing a new regional security initiative that emphasized protection of civilians and cooperation between former enemies. His approach had become a model being studied by military academies in several countries. More importantly, Razin had found a sense of purpose that went beyond following orders or advancing his career. He frequently spoke to groups of young officers about the importance of moral courage in military leadership, about the responsibility to question orders that conflicted with basic human values, and about the possibility of using military training and discipline in service of peace rather than only in service of war. General Petrovich had also undergone a transformation. The faction he led had been the first to implement comprehensive civilian protection protocols, and his territory had become a model for how former conflict zones could be governed during transition periods. He worked closely with international organizations to ensure that humanitarian aid reached all populations regardless of ethnic or political affiliation. The 3 faction leaders who had been present at the monastery that day had gradually moved from merely cooperating on humanitarian issues to actively collaborating on economic reconstruction and political reform. Their example had influenced other regional leaders to reconsider their own approaches to conflict resolution. Dr. Petrov had been promoted to a regional director position with her humanitarian organization, largely based on the success of the programs that had grown out of the monastery incident. She frequently credited Sarah's instinctive understanding of human nature with showing her new approaches to peace building that emphasized personal relationships over institutional frameworks. Dmitri had written a book about the monastery incident that had become required reading in diplomatic training programs around the world. His analysis of how individual moral courage could create openings for larger political transformation had influenced peace processes in several other regions. But perhaps the most significant change was in the young soldiers who had been present that day. Many of them had become advocates for military reform, pushing for training programs that emphasized protection of civilians, cultural sensitivity, and ethical decision-making under pressure. They had experienced firsthand how individual choices could change the trajectory of events, and they carried that understanding into their continued service. Sarah still wore a replica of the original pendant, but she had given the original to a new organization called the Dove Project, which provided support for military personnel struggling with moral injury and ethical conflicts in combat situations. Antonio, the wounded veteran who had first given her the pendant, had become one of the organization's most effective counselors. As Sarah looked around the monastery courtyard during the latest peace conference, she thought about the chain of connections that had led to this moment. A wounded veteran's gift to a young volunteer, a family's sacrifice during military service, a father's struggle with PTSD, a mother's strength during difficult times, refugee children's resilience in the face of trauma, an elderly woman's determination to preserve memory and hope. Each of these individual stories had contributed to Sarah's understanding of human nature and her ability to find the right words at the right moment when everything depended on making a connection between enemies who had forgotten their common humanity. The conference was discussing plans for the next phase of regional reconstruction, but Sarah found herself thinking about the families she would visit later that day. There was still work to be done, still children who needed help processing trauma, still communities that needed support in learning to live together peacefully. As the afternoon session began, Sarah noticed a young woman about her own age approaching the registration table. The woman introduced herself as Maria Peterson, a recent graduate from a peace studies program who had come to the region specifically because she had read about the monastery incident and wanted to contribute to the ongoing work. Sarah smiled as she welcomed Maria to the team. She understood that the most important aspect of what had happened at the monastery wasn't the dramatic moment of confrontation, but the ongoing commitment of individuals who chose to use their skills and energy in service of healing rather than destruction. The story that had begun with a young woman's decision to step forward in a moment of crisis was continuing to unfold through the choices of countless other people who had been inspired to believe that individual actions could make a difference in a complex and troubled world. The sun set behind the monastery walls, casting long shadows across the courtyard where soldiers had once stood ready for battle. Sarah touched the pendant at her throat and thought about Antonio's words. "Promise me that you'll never forget that one person can make all the difference in someone's life." She had kept that promise, and in doing so, she had discovered that sometimes one person's courage to step forward can create ripples that change the lives of thousands of others, transforming moments of potential tragedy into foundations for lasting peace.